You're listening to The Pilot's Portfolio, formerly called the Pilot Money Podcast. To learn more about the name change, join us in Season 2.
If somebody sues me and my insurance isn't enough, the LLC will provide that corporate veil, so to speak, to protect me. And, that's a misconception in aviation, because if you're flying the plane, you're the pilot in command, you're going to have personal liability, and the LLC will not protect you for that.
You're listening to the Pilot Money Podcast, the show dedicated to guiding professional pilots towards a future of financial success and stability. Fly along with your host, Timothy P. Pope, as he provides financial planning insights and answers to your burning questions and dives into real-life stories from fellow pilots who share their successes and cautionary tales. The Pilot Money Podcast takes off now.
Well, welcome back to the Pilot Money Podcast, folks. We're excited to have you here. Today, we've got another engaging interview episode, and we are going to be talking about how to properly insure an airplane. So if you own an aircraft, if you want to own an aircraft, or if you rent an aircraft, insurance is something that you need to know about, how to avoid leaving that big, beautiful net worth that you've worked so hard to acquire, how to avoid leaving that exposed in the way of liability. So that is what we will be talking about later. A lot to cover before we get to the interview. So if you are new here, welcome. Glad to have you along. My name is Timothy P. Pope. I'm your host. I'm a certified financial planner that specializes in the planning needs of the professional pilot. That's what we talk about on this show. I also run a boutique financial planning practice serving the same. Recently, I was talking to somebody and I says, I should probably get back to the business at hand on the show. Typically, we talk about how to earn money, how to invest money, how to save money well, tax efficiency, just in general, how to take advantage of this awesome career as a professional pilot in a smart way. And I was thinking this because the last couple of episodes have been surrounding how to acquire an aircraft, or we talked to an aircraft owner and talked about the costs beyond the purchase. And the person I was talking to said, hey, you know what? You are talking to pilots, right? And of course, they want to know how to purchase an aircraft and how to do it well, and the things that they should consider when thinking about aircraft ownership. And you know what? Your responses to those episodes, the feedback that you've given, have been great. So thank you for that. And in fact, there's some questions that have come in surrounding how to think about aircraft ownership in the lens of a financial plan. And so there are some Q&A episodes that I need to put together. Those Q&As have been coming in. I need to address those and to do another episode. In fact, looking at the Q4 content calendar is packed. I mean, there's a lot going on. There's a lot to talk about, right? So open enrollment season is right around the corner for most carriers. So we're certainly going to want to talk about how you guys can maximize your benefits, avoid leaving money on the table just through organizing benefits between spouses. We've seen 5-figure savings per year, okay? That's just on open enrollment. That's crazy. So that's important. So pay attention. And the fact is that the benefit elections you sign up for may not be the same for the guy next to you. Okay, so pay attention to your situation there. Our tag is happening this week, and that's amidst a hiring slowdown. So of course, I want to take a minute and talk to those guys and girls going through a military transition with a goal ending is in the 121 world or in business aviation. So we'll talk to them in a later episode. Also, the Fed cut rates the other week. Okay. And so this is gonna have some ripple effects. First, you're probably going to see it in your short-term savings, right? So your emergency fund, where over the past couple of years, we've enjoyed 4 to 5%. So we could expect those rates to go down. But we can also expect the interest rates on mortgages to go down. In fact, in anticipation of the Fed cutting rates, we saw rates decrease over the summer. Maybe there's more in store. And so, is it time for you to move at base? We will talk about that. That's all coming up later in this quarter. These kind of conversations close out the year. But first, I do have a big announcement for the podcast. And the big announcement is this. We are going to change the name to the Pilot Money Podcast. The show is staying the same. The content is staying the same. the structure, all of that is staying the same. The only thing that's changing at this point is the name. And we're not quite certain what the new name is going to be. So we'd love to hear from you. What do you think we should change the name of the show to? Send us an email, pilotmoneypodcast@ceterainvestors.com. Probably the obvious question that you're asking right now is, Tim, why are you changing the name of the Pilot Money Podcast? It's a great name. And I agree with you. It is a great name. But the reason that we're changing the name is quite simple. I went to trademark the name, and there's a few folks with substantially similar or identical names ahead of us in the trademarking process. And so, it was easy enough to say, well, we're getting close to the end of season 1. Let's just go ahead and change the name. So keep your eyes and ears out. We will have a name change soon. The fun part of this is that you guys get to be involved. So if you have a suggestion for what the new name of this show should be, send me an email, pilotmoneypodcast@ceterainvestors.com. That's CETERA, investors.com. We'll make an announcement with the new name when we decide. Throw a name in a hat and let's see if it wins. So with that, let's get into today's episode. Again, how to properly insure your airplane, things you definitely should be doing, and then things to avoid. And because this is an interview episode, be sure to stick around to the debrief where I'm going to talk about the top 3 things that I want you to take away from today's episode. David, welcome to the Pilot Money Podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, Tim.
So, David, I'm excited to be talking to you today. So you are a partner in Schrager Hampson Aviation Insurance Group. And the past couple of episodes, we've been having conversations about acquiring aircraft. We talked to aircraft owners, and I think we would be remiss not to have insurance as part of the conversation. So excited for what we discussed today.
Yeah, thank you. I'm excited to talk to you about these topics as well.
Well, let's start the way that all of our guests, we always ask. So we'd love to hear about your aviation background and then what you're up to today.
My aviation background started when I was very young. I always loved airplanes and everything aviation for as long as I can remember, since I was a young boy. And we used to make several trips to Florida every year because I had grandparents on both sides of my family that lived down there. Both of my parents were from Florida, and we lived up in New Hampshire. So we would just fly commercial airlines, but even just flying commercially just fascinated me. You get on this amazing flying machine, it would transport me to a different place, and I just became fascinated with it. As I grew up, I started reading various flying magazines, and I always wanted to stop at any general aviation airport that we drove past to watch airplanes fly. I just had that passion, that love for aviation, and I never had the opportunity to take flying lessons when I was younger. I didn't come from an aviation family, didn't have anyone else that flew, so I didn't get into it at that point, and my career went off in a different direction. Then I got back into aviation when I was in my early 30s. My wife found a picture of me in some aviation gear from when I was younger, and for one of my birthdays, she got me a gift certificate for 3 flying lessons.
Nice.
And that kind of reignited the passion.
Yeah.
And then the rest is history. I started taking flying lessons, and I was already working in general insurance, but I tried to find a way to combine my passion for aviation with my insurance experience, much similar to what you've done, Tim, in your practice, and which I think is awesome. And I just, specialized, and I started prospecting some accounts at the time with my prior employer, and I came across this agency owned by Dan Schrager that a lot of potential prospects were with already in Massachusetts. So I basically just cold called Dan Schrager and asked him if he was interested in selling his business, and he was, and it was one of those things where the timing was right, and we worked out a deal, and it's been great. Dan's remained part of the business even after the sale, and my parents are partners in the business as well. My dad came from a long insurance career as an executive at a large global insurance brokerage firm, and my parents believed in me enough to invest as well, and with their support, we were able to buy this business and grow it over 9.5 years now.
Man, that's phenomenal. So the passion was there, which I feel like, for a lot of aviators, it's just you have it or you don't. The business acumen and expertise of insurance is there. And then you just sought the opportunity to combine both of them so you could live your best life. I saw a post where your office is hiring, made me a little jealous because in the job description, it was along the lines of like, hey, sit in your office and watch airplanes, watch the runway, airplanes take off and land all day as you helped owners with their insurance. That's pretty cool.
That's where our office is located, right on an airport on the second floor of a building looking at the runways. And it actually happens to be a small airport that I used to visit frequently when I was younger to watch airplanes. So it's kind of cool to have an office there now.
That is fantastic. That is quite awesome, I'd say. David, could you tell us what trends are you seeing in the aviation insurance space right now?
So the good news is that the rates are stabilizing. Now, by stabilized, I mean that we're still seeing some increases in general, but we're seeing increases more in line with inflation. And that's good news because for the last, about 5 years, I feel like all I've been doing is giving bad news to clients because we've gone through a period of what we call a hard market insurance, where not only rates been going up, but underwriting has been tightening as well at the same time.
The underwriting been tightening.
The reason for that is because we went through a period of time that now it's hard to even remember those good times, but between 2006 and like 2018, where it was a very soft market, rates were going down, underwriting got looser. And there was also a doubling of aviation insurance in the marketplace during that period of time as well. So it was many years of rates being depressed, definitely not keeping up with inflation. And insurers lost, as a whole, collectively, they lost millions of dollars of losses, not more than what premiums were. So, for example, in that period of time I mentioned, I believe the number was something like $685 million of losses that they sustained. So there was a lot to make up for. And the market started to turn in 2019. It got worse in 20 and 21. 20 was brutal because we were in the midst of the pandemic. And, I had to deliver, particularly from our commercial clients, some pretty brutal renewal increases when they were, everyone was struggling with shutdowns and no one knew what was going to happen in the world. So that was a really tough year. But then they continued in 21, 20, 23, a little bit better. In 24, we really seen things start to level off. And insurers rates are at a better place, probably more in line with where they should be. I don't know that we'll see rates as low as they were before. I mean, to give you an example, Tim, I had a client that flew a jet and had a $4 million hull, insured hull value, and he had $20 million of liability. And he was paying a premium of, I don't know, like $11,000 or $12,000 with those sort of values. There was no way a premium like that could be. Now he's paying, I think, close to $40,000, but that premium is enough to think of one loss and how many you'd have to make up. That was just some of the sort of premiums we saw at that point. But I don't think we're going to see those again, at least anytime in the foreseeable future. But I do think they've gone to a point where insurers can cover the claims and maybe be expected to make a profit, which no one likes to hear insurance companies making profit, but they're profit-making companies. Most of them are publicly traded, and they have a fiduciary obligation to present a return to their shareholders. And we don't have any government subsidized aviation insurance pools. And I don't think the political capital for politicians to lobby for that, I don't think that would be necessarily popular. So I don't think we're going to ever see that. So we need to have insurers that make some profit so that they stay in the market, they compete. And the more that we have competing, the better the outcome will be for us. And that's what's happened as well in the last year or two. Because rates have gone up, we've had some new entrants to the market. New companies have come into the market now that are saying, hey, rates are high. We could maybe make some money here. And they started opening aviation divisions and competing with some of the legacy insurers. And that's helping to stabilize rates and in some cases even bring things down a little bit. So that's all positive news. And I think aircraft owners will start to see a little bit better outcomes than they did the last 3 to 5 years.
So rates are stabilizing. So that's a good thing. More competition usually is a good thing as well.
Exactly.
Because so the rates may not go down, but the insurers can keep each other in check with the competition. So with the insurance side, who are you insuring for? What are you insuring against? Tell us a little bit about that.
In our firm, we insure pretty much everything aviation, from someone flying a personal aircraft, be it a basic, 2-seater or 4-seater. We also insure large corporate jets, and then we insure aviation businesses too. And that might be an FBO, flight school, charter company, aircraft maintenance facility, or businesses that just happen to use the corporate aircraft, and they may not be in the aviation industry, but they have a corporate flight department. Sometimes we'll have all of their general insurance with another broker, but they'll come to us for the aviation specialization. We work with some companies that do that as well. So if it basically flies, we'll probably can help you insure it.
It's a fairly broad spectrum. Let's narrow and focus in, because the Pilot Money podcast, our listeners are the professional pilot. No surprise that on the financial plan of many professional pilots, there's this goal that says, hey, I'd like to own an airplane at some point. So talk to us about, being properly insured if you own a personal aircraft. And then maybe we can talk about some CFI stuff and DPE stuff, because, we do have clients that do that on the side as well.
Absolutely. So, sort of focusing on the personal aircraft in aviation insurance, we call that someone being insured for pleasure and business use, because you might be insured just for taking, pleasure rides for recreation, but you might also use your airplane to go to business meetings or appointments. And, you're not in a commercial aviation business, but you use it as a business tool like I do with my plane. And that would sort of fall in that category. And there's two main components to think about in a very broad sense. We get in the weeds on this as well, but the policy is called an aircraft hull and liability policy. And that kind of describes the two broad areas of coverage that there are. The hull is a first-party coverage, and that's covering the risk of physical damage to your aircraft that you're flying and that you own. And the liability, of course, is a third-party coverage, and it protects you against third-party claims of property damage or bodily injury if someone else suffers a loss and they allege that you're responsible for it. Both of those areas are ones to look at and make sure that you understand what you're covering, how much coverage you need, and then we get into specifics if you'd like about that.
Yeah, so hull, somebody hits my airplane on the ramp or a storm comes through, and so it covers the plane itself, and then liability would be something that I did that I was responsible for.
Right. So one more thing I'll mention, and that is that there are two types of policies when you get liability limit. One is you can have a policy with a smooth limit, also termed a combined single limit. You have your liability limit includes passengers as well. So if you have $1 million smooth, that $1 million will include coverage for your passengers. And if you only had one passenger that was injured and there's no other liability claim, they could potentially take advantage of the full $1 million limit. You also have what's probably more common is you have policies that have a per passenger sublimit. You could have that same policy with $1 million and it only has $100,000 per passenger. And there's a big difference between those two, the smooth limit and the per passenger, because that per passenger means that even if you have $1 million of coverage, if one passenger is injured, they cannot collect more than $100,000 from your $1 million policy. When you have a liability, make sure you know whether you have a smooth limit or you have a per passenger sublimit. And of course, the per passenger sublimit policy is less expensive, but the coverage is much less too. You have policies less common, they have a per person sublimit. And if it has $100,000 per person, that means that not only your passengers sublimited to $100,000, but anyone else injured in another airplane or on the ground, they would also be limited to that $100,000 of coverage. So the policies not all created equally when you see the liability limit. Make sure you dig a bit deeper and see and understand whether you have a smooth policy or you have a per person limitation.
If you own an airplane and you are not super familiar with what David just said, you need to be talking to your insurance broker to make sure that you understand what your policy, the protections that your policy is giving you item by item, so you can understand where you're exposed to liability and where you're covered.
Correct. Absolutely.
Now, with aviation insurance, do we need to go through a broker or an agent to purchase insurance, or are there things that we can go direct to the insurer?
Well, that's a good question. And there is one insurance company that's a direct writer among the, say, 13, 14 insurers that there are in the U.S. But other than that one insurer that does direct writing, all of the other insurers, you go through the brokerage channel for distribution. So unless you wanted to just get one quote from one insurer, you would need to go to a broker to be able to access the other quotes. And most brokers that do aviation insurance are fairly specialized, and that's an area that they focus on.
If you want to cast your wide net and get good pricing, you probably want to go through a broker. A friend of mine owns an airplane, and he was telling me that if he went to one broker and got a quote, he was kind of locked into that price for 90 days before he could go get another quote. What is that about?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Tim, because a lot of people have confusion about that and don't quite understand how that works. And it is a little bit unique to the insurance industry. I won't say it's unique to aviation insurance, because a lot of insurance companies do this in various lines of insurance. But what they do is the insurance companies obviously work with multiple insurance brokers at a time. They have contracts with many brokers, and they only want to work with one broker on one particular prospect at a time. And that's because they don't want to have their product going out with different quote terms, not just pricing, but even coverage terms that can cause confusion. And they want to be able to negotiate specific terms with one broker for one client at a time. Because of that, they do what's called a broker of record assignment. What that means is that either the first broker that submits the account would be the broker of record for that period of time. And it's usually 90 days is usually a general rule of thumb for how long that broker of record would last. But if you're not the first broker, maybe someone else submitted it, but you want to work with a specific broker, you could sign a broker of record letter to make that clear which broker you want to work with. But you can't work with multiple brokers with the same companies at once. And because most of us that specialize in aviation insurance have access to all the same insurance companies, it usually behooves you to choose the broker you want to work with and let them go to market and get all the quotes. Because when the underwriters see submissions coming from multiple brokers at once and they're kind of tripping over each other, it tends to place your account in a bit of a negative light, because the insurance underwriters will feel like you're kind of jumping around everywhere and you're probably not going to be a long-term loyal client. And they like to write accounts that are going to be with them for a long time, that requires quite a lot of resources on their end to issue the policy and underwrite it. And they're not looking to just do it for 1 year. They want to develop long-term relationships by and large. So you're better off interviewing various brokers and finding the broker that you feel most comfortable with, has the best professional expertise, will provide good service, and that you feel has good relationships with their underwriting partners, the insurers. Then let that broker go to market with your account. That's the best strategy to get the best result.
And this is going to be on tail number? Like they're going to see different brokers are asking for this coverage on this tail number, and they're going to pump the brakes on that. You're going to be locked out from a tail number.
Correct. And sometimes they'll look at tail number plus they'll look at the entity, the individual, or the company plus their address, because obviously you could have someone that's buying an airplane and someone else already has it insured. They're trying to get quotes, they're acquiring it. So tail number isn't the be all and end all, but that'll be, they look at that plus, who the entity is.
Okay, that's fair. So there's about 13 underwriters or insurers. And if you specialize in aviation insurance, you probably have access to most of all of them. Instead of trying to go from broker to broker to see if there's any different terms that would be more favorable for you on the front end, maybe interview multiple brokers to see if that's where you want to place your business and let them do the work. So I think two things come to mind. One is, if you know you're going to have to renew your insurance on your airplane, don't wait till the last minute if you're unhappy with your current broker, because you're going to get locked out and then you might have to go with what you get or renew with the current broker. That's number one. Number two, you bring up a really great point. It sounds like there's a lot going on in that broker relationship. So talk to us about how to find a good broker. What's the earmarks and characteristics of somebody that's great you'd want to do business with, and maybe somebody you might want to avoid doing business with?
There are a couple of things to look at. One is, first, talking in a broad sense, and most people have an insurance agent that they work with on all their lines of insurance. They may have worked with somebody for many, many years for their businesses or personally. And that person is probably not the best person to do your aviation insurance.
Why is that?
Because there's so many nuances to it, with, like, for example, the pilot warranty. But if they're not a pilot, they don't understand how that works. That's actually a warranty in the policy. If you violate that, you're warranting that's true. And if you violate it, there's no coverage. So you don't want someone who doesn't really know the aviation lingo and terminology to probably be dabbling in that. So, and they'll probably be thankful, not to have to work in an area they're not totally comfortable with. So you'd be better off choosing someone who specializes in aviation, even if you have another broker for everything else. And sometimes a lot of times we'll work with non-aviation insurance agencies that come to us because they have an aviation account and they're not quite sure what to do with it. And we'll try to help them provide the expertise in the background the best that we can. Anytime you add somebody else as a middleman, the old game of telephone where the message gets mixed up when it goes through more people. So it's better to go, I think, directly with the aviation specialist. That's the first thing, is look for a broker specialized in aviation specifically. And then beyond that, ask them a little bit about their firm and the people in it and their level of experience. Now, many of us in aviation insurance are pilots, but not everyone is. Most of our employees are not. But many of them have years and years of experience in the field. And that's what's most important, is that you have the experience, and then asking them a little bit about what the relationship is like with their insurers as well. And I think that, from my opinion, we represent clients first and foremost as a broker. But in my opinion, the aviation insurance brokers that take a very confrontational attitude to the insurers, like, we'll beat them down to get you the best price and quotes, and like take sort of they're the enemy's approach, that doesn't really work very well. We want to have a very collaborative relationship with your underwriters and your insurer, so that they trust you when you tell them something, or when you need a special accommodation, they can get it done. And that's the approach, some brokers take. That's certainly the culture we have at our firm, where we try to develop such great relationships with our insurers that we can sometimes get things done that perhaps others can't. And that's the sort of broker you want to look for. And then obviously ask them a little about customer service, like, who's going to be handling my account? Will I be talking to the same people every time? Or do you call 1-800 number and get a different person every time? Be able to get somebody who gets to know you as well is important, because sometimes in aviation, you can have very unique needs. You bring another partner on who's a pilot, or you want to have a trip you want to do to another territory that's maybe outside the country, need to get insurance for it. Having someone that knows you will help with getting those special requests accomplished.
Yeah. I think you've given a good framework for folks to start to think about the questions they're going to ask potential brokers, particularly if that's a long-term relationship. You're going to be trusting that broker to do the best work for you between them, the aircraft owner, and the insurers. I'd love to hear about, let's say I own an airplane. Are there limits on the number of pilots who can fly my airplane that would also be covered under my insurance policy? So that's one question. And then the other question is about renter's insurance, because I actually don't own an airplane right now, but I rent. So this is maybe a selfish question for what kind of liability I want to keep away from myself as a renter.
Yeah, so to address your first question with regards to the pilots that can fly your aircraft, most policies, not all, but most have both named pilots. Those are specific people the company has, they vetted, their experience and their history, and they've approved them to fly. And then there's usually an open pilot warranty too. And the open pilot warranty means that any pilot that meets those experience criteria and ratings can fly your aircraft, and you as the aircraft owner will be covered if you let them fly your airplane. So usually there's no limit. I mean, if someone meets the open pilot warranty, you can give them the keys. If something happens, you would be covered for that accident, assuming they met that criteria. Usually, though, if you want to name pilots, a lot of people want to name multiple pilots on their policy. You can usually name up to 4 to 5 maximum. Usually when you get to 5 pilots, a lot of times they'll remove the open pilot warranty if you have that many named pilots. So you need to look at that. And also, some policies are named pilots only, and they don't have an open pilot warranty. Those are usually aircraft that are a unique and unusual aircraft, like a lot of experimental aircraft or aerobatic aircraft will be named pilots only. Because of the unique nature of that type of risk, the underwriter wants to review every pilot that flies it. And the second question was renter's insurance. And if you're flying someone else's plane, maybe you're flying under the pilot warranty, the open pilot warranty of a friend's plane, you're still probably going to want to have renter's insurance, because even if you meet their pilot warranty, their policy, the owner's policy is designed to protect them. It's not designed to protect you. You could always try to get added as an additional insured on their policy and ask the insurer to waive their subrogation rights, meaning the insurer agrees that they're not going to come back against you if you cause damage to the aircraft they're insuring. But a lot of insurers don't agree to that, or maybe it's a spontaneous sort of ad hoc situation where a friend's like, hey, let's go fly. You don't have time to have them contact the insurer to get you added on as additional insured with the waiver of subrogation. You want to have some protection for yourself while you're flying if somebody alleged that you were responsible for causing the accident. And that's where renter's insurance comes in. But that being said, renter's insurance is not a substitution for someone flying a plane that doesn't meet the open pilot warranty. Because I've had people call us before and they'll say, well, I can't get the pilot approved on my policy, but I'll just have them get renter's insurance. That's not going to be a total solution. It may cover it if the renter pilot or the pilot borrowing your plane is responsible for causing the accident, but renter's insurance is a liability coverage. It only covers physical damage to the airplane if you as a renter are liable for causing the accident. If there was an act of God, like a weather-related issue, like hail damage, for example, or there was a mechanical failure, like an engine failure, had nothing to do with the pilot who was flying. And let's say that pilot didn't meet the pilot warranty of the owner's policy. The owner's policy could deny coverage because you didn't meet the pilot warranty, even though it was a mechanical failure. And the renter pilot, the non-owned policy, also called renter's pilot policy, could deny coverage because as a pilot, you weren't liable. There could be one of those areas where there's coverage nowhere. So you want to make sure that, you meet the pilot warranty under the policy of the aircraft for the aircraft you're flying and have renter's coverage as well. You have to, it's a twofold situation that you need to look to verify both.
Wow. Yeah. Because that would be in an unfortunate circumstance where the issue kind of fell through the cracks of both coverages.
Correct.
And then the aircraft owner is left exposed. One question that I've got for you is, as I work with clients in their financial plans, they want to buy airplanes. What impact do you see that age has on insurability and premiums and so forth?
Yeah, the age is a big factor that underwriters look at, and it's been challenging, especially in recent years, as underwriting has tightened with pilots that we call term senior pilots that look to purchase a new airplane that perhaps is more complex, it's a higher hull value, and they're more senior in age when they make that purchase. And you're right, a lot of times it's because they've now got to the point where they've accumulated the assets, they have the income where they can do that. And that can be very difficult to get insurance in some cases. Most insurers, it varies by insurer and type of aircraft, but most insurers have stricter underwriting requirements when pilots get above 70 years of age. That's kind of a benchmark where things get a bit more challenging for a new purchase particularly. And then 75 gets even more difficult. And probably if you're in your late 70s, 80s, then you can have a very difficult time getting coverage for a new purchase. I won't say it won't be possible. If you're willing to pay enough, almost anything is possible. But at some point, the premiums don't become feasible financially. On the flip side, if you're a senior pilot, but you've had the same airplane for many years, you've been flying it for many, many years, and you've been with the same insurer, and this is where we tell clients that, particularly as you age, it's good to build loyalty with an insurer and don't jump around to different companies. You have that long history and you haven't had any claims. Most insurers will stay pretty loyal and they'll continue to renew you well into your 70s and even as late as the early 80s, depending on the plane you're flying. Now, if you're flying a turboprop or a multi-engine jet, you're probably going to have to fly with somebody else sooner than you would if you're flying a Skyhawk. But there may be a solution where the insurer is to compromise and say you have to fly dual at a certain age with another pilot. But those are discussions most insurers have well before they dictate it, and discussions you have with your broker as you start to get above 70, particularly if you're flying one of those more complex aircraft. But the good news is if you already have the plane, if you had it insured for a while, you're probably going to keep flying it. It's bigger challenges when someone is new to the market purchasing an airplane. That's why I also will sometimes counsel clients and tell them that if you want to transition into this turboprop, you might be better off to do it while you're still in your 60s, and then you have a longer runway than to wait until you're in your 70s. It's going to be more challenging. So sometimes strategizing about when you do it is important as well, because you might have a longer runway of flying it afterwards if you do it a bit earlier, assuming you can financially afford it. One other thing I'll mention too about it is that it's very controversial, the whole rating based on pilot age, and a lot of clients will obviously be unhappy hearing that, and they'll mention terms like age discrimination, and it is age discrimination, but it's a legal form of discrimination. Insurance regulators allow insurers pretty wide latitude for discriminating on certain demographics, not all demographics, certain ones, and age is one of them, because everyone ages at a different rate. Of course, we all know people that are 80s that act and look like they're 60 and vice versa. But just taking the general population at large, physiology and reaction time and cognitive abilities do decline in general as somebody ages above a certain age. So underwriters aren't able to individually evaluate each pilot. They have to look broadly at how those factors decline over time and how that affects risk. And that's why it's more challenging, more expensive to insure senior pilots.
So senior pilot is 70 and above, and it sounds like we would start to run into some issues with the higher complexity airframes. But if you've owned your airplane for a long time, you've had the same relationship for a while, then that could smooth the way for you. And then when would you start expecting, let's say, single engine pistons? or multi-engine pistons? Like, is it that 70, 75? Is that the same for those classes as well?
If they already have coverage, if you're flying a single engine piston, you're going to be good until you're at least 75, maybe even into your early 80s. It'll depend on whether it's high performance and a really high hull value. Like sometimes pilots that are flying, a newer Cirrus, maybe they've flown it for a while, but the hull value is still fairly high. That's going to be a bit more challenging about 75. But normally until your late 70s, it might be more expensive. You'll still have insurance. A liability limit will be a bit less than what you had before. And multi-engine piston, when you're about 75, it's going to be a lot more difficult. I still think you could be good up into your 80 or early 80s, if depending on the insurer you're with. Every insurer has different underwriting criteria, and those do change over time too. So it's hard to provide a broad generalization with every insurer. But I think above 75 is going to be more challenging, and if not getting coverage, just getting liability limits and rates being a bit higher.
That's good to know. So my message to the listeners is plan well, give yourself as much runway as possible for your aircraft ownership. I'd love to hear, what are some common maybe misconceptions that pilots have when trying to address the liability of aircraft ownership? If you see things come across your desk, you've been doing this for a long time, I'd love to hear what you see.
Yes, absolutely. So one of the most common misconceptions regarding liability is when aircraft owners will buy an airplane that they're using personally, they'll put it in an LLC, and maybe they can only get a certain insurance limit. Perhaps they can only get $1 million of liability because of their experience, the type of airplane it is. Maybe they have a lot of assets to protect, and they have a $10 million umbrella, for example, and personal umbrellas exclude aviation almost universally. So, they may put an LLC and think that, I'm all set because it's under an LLC. If somebody sues me and my insurance isn't enough, the LLC will provide that corporate veil, so to speak, to protect me. And, that's a misconception in aviation, because if you're flying the plane, you're the pilot in command, you're going to have personal liability, and the LLC will not protect you for that. So that's not to say there aren't reasons for putting your plane in an LLC or other limited liability company, but personal liability protection for the pilot who's flying is not one of them. Now, if you have multiple partners, then it's very valuable to have the plane in that LLC or that limited liability company, because what it will do is, if you're not the pilot flying, and let's say your partner is flying the plane and they have an accident, they'll have all the issues around their personal liability, but that limited liability company will provide protection for you as a partner who wasn't flying at the time. So if you have partners, definitely. Or if you have it in a business and you hire a corporate pilot, like you hire someone to fly you around in the plane, then absolutely having that limited liability company serves a really important purpose. So that being said, I always advise aircraft owners to buy the highest liability limit that you can get. And that's, of course, it's feasible for you to cover from a budgeting perspective. But sometimes you're limited you want to buy more, but you're limited by your experience and only get a certain limit. So when that's the case, and often is, to consult with a corporate asset protection attorney, because there are things you can do outside of insurance to structure your assets in the most favorable way to help protect you if something does happen. And I think that this is giving me a little personal opinion here, but I think that as a pilot and aircraft owner, there's a moral obligation to get liability protection as much as we reasonably can to be able to settle claims if we cause property damage or bodily injury to someone innocent on the ground, for example, that didn't sign up for our flying. We have an obligation to have something there to take care of them. But beyond that obligation, and we can only get so much liability, our next obligation is to our family and setting up our assets so that we protect our family. And if we own a business, protect our partners and our employees as well. So, and that gets into, like I said, some of the asset protection stuff that you should look at too. But yeah, definitely always try to get the highest liability limit that's feasible.
So I heard a big misconception is, hey, I don't necessarily have a business interest for my airplane, nor do I have partners. So I own my airplane personally, and I'm going to put it into an LLC, and that LLC may provide some coverage, and you're saying, hey, not so fast, right, in that case. Let me throw a wrench in there. What if you are providing instruction out of that aircraft maybe you're providing instruction and you're the only owner on it. There's no partners. Does that change the calculus at all? Or is that in terms of the protection and the liability?
It does, and all the same issues and challenges arise with that, although there's a couple of things to consider insurance-wise when you do that. For one, that's a commercial use, and you have to get special coverage for that. Like if you get a normal pleasure and business policy that I mentioned for personal aircraft, that won't cover that type of use. So that's called an instruction and rental, or even just dual instruction if you're not renting your airplane. That's commercial use. You have to specifically insure to be covered. But you also, another important coverage that you can usually get endorsed with that type of policy is negligent instruction coverage. So that's a professional liability, like an errors and omissions type of coverage that CFIs get, a malpractice insurance, if you will, for flight instructors. And that covers them if, the person you gave instruction to is later off flying on their own after they've gotten instruction and left, and they have an accident and they claim that the accident occurred because you gave them bad instruction, and it would cover those claims. They're very rare, but it's important to have that. And it's not very expensive to get that coverage added. But CFI is still going to have personal liability if they're the ones giving instruction, even if it's in an LLC. So again, it's important to have the best liability protection you can.
Thanks for clearing that up, because you see that often, or at least I see that often with clients who own an airplane and, it's inside of an LLC and there may or may not be a business use for that, or may not be additional partners. David, in your experience, do you have any stories of things that gone well or things where somebody maybe learned the hard way about the importance of proper insurance?
Yeah, many claims examples I can think of that have gone well and gone bad. And I'll start with the ones that have gone bad. And, usually that's been because of one of several things being violated in the policy. And those are either the pilot warranty and the use of the aircraft are the two largest ones. And sometimes policy territory too. That could be another one, although I haven't seen that one as commonly be an issue because most policies have a pretty wide territory that's covered. But pilot warranty are big ones. And I'll mention a couple quick examples. One example we had was, somebody doing what was found to be unapproved charter operations. The old 134.5, so to speak, that people are, doing charter and it's not, they don't have a charter certificate, but they're holding out for the public. They're taking money and maybe a commercial pilot's flying it, but they don't have a charter operation. So I have seen a claim that's been denied because someone was doing that. They had actually a pretty bad accident with injuries, and the claim was ultimately denied because they weren't insured for that use. I'm sure there are legal ramifications as well with the FAA for not having a charter certificate, but from the insurance perspective, it was because they didn't have that coverage use insured. It was just a normal personal policy. And then I've also seen situations where a claim has been denied because there was a violation of the pilot warranty. And it wasn't because the pilot wasn't approved. This is actually a situation where the pilot actually met the pilot warranty. In fact, I believe he was even a named pilot, but he didn't complete the training that was required. Sometimes pilot warranties not only specify who can fly, but if it's a more complex aircraft, like or a turboprop or a jet, a lot of the times when we have training requirements, like for example, you have to go to specific simulator training within the last 12 months. And even a pilot that had many hours in the airplane, if they did not go to the training that they were supposed to go to, and there was an accident, particularly if it was pilot error-related accident, which the pilot made a mistake that maybe training could have prevented, they have a right to deny that claim. And I've seen that happen in several cases. So looking at the pilot warranty and, making sure those training requirements aren't there. We hope you will do it. You have to do it. You're warranting you're going to do it or there will be no coverage. So those are a couple of bad situations. And then there's plenty of good ones. Most of the claim situations we have are, I won't say they're positive, but the outcome is satisfactory. And most aviation insurers have claims adjusters. They really care about doing right by the client. Most of them are aviators themselves, and the pilots have been in the industry. They love aviation, and they really care about doing a good job for the client. So that I was in general insurance too, and I didn't get the same sense of care from the claims adjusters in general insurance as I see in aviation. So that's a good thing. And I've seen situations where, for example, someone's had a total loss, and they were so concerned that they weren't going to be able to buy another airplane again to replace what they lost. But because aviation insurance, the whole insurance is on an agreed value basis, whatever you have on the policy, the insurer is going to pay you. And you want to make sure your hull is insured for the right value. But a lot of people think it's going to work like auto insurance does, where, when you have a claim, the insurer goes and looks at the Kelly Blue Book values or something similar, and then they give you the depreciated value at the time. In aviation insurance, if you have an insured for a certain value, you're going to get that less of deductible, irrespective of where the market is at the time of a loss. So that's a plus. And as long as you have it insured properly, then you'll have a best outcome you can in the circumstances. And then I've seen some liability claims where the insurer has really stepped up to the plate to defend the client, and most insurers do a great job of that. Our aviation insurer, they either have in-house attorneys or they have aviation attorneys on retention, and they do everything they can to get the claims settled within the policy limit. So even clients that have had somewhat lower limit policies, a lot of times I've seen them settled within policy limits. And the good thing is the legal defense costs when the insurer is defending you are in addition to the policy limit. So whatever the insurer expends defending you doesn't subtract away from your policy limit. So that's good as well.
Yeah, no, that is a positive. And then going back to the stated hold value in your policy, I mean, this is why it's important when it's time to renew, see what your airplane is worth. I mean, I'm particularly thinking about the last couple of years where we saw some real increases in value in terms of aircraft. Like, don't say, oh, it's going to shoot my premium up. I'm going to keep this lower whole value on my policy. Well, if something happens, that's what the insurer is going to pay out.
Right.
And you could be wishing that you had increased it.
Exactly. And that's been a more common situation the last couple of years where market values have shot way up. And, a lot of clients have found themselves underinsured. And we've been increasing values or renewal when that's the case. And we have that discussion. But, it does increase the premium. So that's the downside of it. But we have had a couple situations in the last 2 years where somebody didn't have enough hull coverage because they didn't keep up with the market, or they didn't want to pay a higher premium that would be associated with it. But that's the downside, is that then you won't have enough to replace what you had. I would recommend that everybody looks at that, either using the two best tools that we usually use in the market are Aircraft Blue Book or VREF. And I think if you're an AOPA member, you may even have access to a free version of VREF to get values. But that's a good starting point, because aircraft values, especially if you have a legacy aircraft from 30, 40, 50 years ago, the values can vary dramatically for the same year, make, and model, depending on how it was upgraded, because most likely it's had various avionics upgrades, maybe it's had a new paint job, interior. Those things can all change the value dramatically. You can sometimes see airplanes of the same vintage that are a 2 or 3-fold difference in value because of what's been done.
I think that's a really good point. That's a good reminder.
Just a couple of things to add. One is that when you do have a claim, like you have a partial loss where the aircraft can be repaired and it doesn't need to be totaled, and that's the majority of claims that we see. One thing that's important to be cognizant of is that something in the policy called betterment. So insurance is meant to put you back to the same position as where you were. You're no better, no worse. That's the ideal situation. And if you have an airplane, for example, that has an engine which is about to be due for overhaul, and you have a situation where, like, say, you have a prop strike, for example, that's a common situation where the engine has to be replaced, and maybe your engine was 100 hours away from overhaul time. The insurer is going to deduct something for the fact called betterment because now you have a 0-time engine. So you may have to put some money into the claim. Obviously, your plane is better because you have a new engine, but you have to put some money out of pocket into the claim. And sometimes that causes a source of discontent because people feel like, they shouldn't have to put money in because they have insurance. But again, you have to think of that concept of insurance being make you whole. If it makes you better than whole because of the situation, then they're going to expect you to put something in as well. So I just mentioned that because it's sometimes a surprise for people. But the insurers are normally pretty fair with how they calculate that betterment calculation. And, there's can always be some back and forth on that. But that's something just to be aware of. I would also suggest that if you have an airplane, don't just renew your policy every year without looking at your coverages. And I don't mean necessarily moving it or shopping at different places every year, but looking at the coverages, having at least a review where you have a discussion with your broker, look at your values and your liability limits. And, maybe your personal needs have changed and you need higher liability, or maybe you've gotten more experience in ratings and you qualify for more liability, but the value needs to be adjusted because of the market. But don't just renew it without thinking about it. Most aviation insurance brokers always send a renewal application, usually about 90 days before your policy renews. And that's a chance for you to look at everything and fill that out and complete it. And if changes need to be made or discussions should be had, and talk to your broker. That's the time to look at your policy and make sure you keep up with all of your needs for your aviation insurance.
Yeah. I like that betterment point. I did not think about that. Otherwise, there'd be some misaligned incentives, with the parties involved. Well, David, this has been a fantastic conversation. So if it flies, you insure it. Going from, personal and recreational to business, you do work with flight schools and FBOs as well. Where can listeners learn more about your insurance agency?
If you're interested in learning more, you can go to our website, which is www.planeinsurance.com. And of course, plane is Plane, spelled like airplane, planeinsurance.com.
I love that URL. I won't ask you how much you had to pay to get that one, but
well, fortunately, that came from Dan Schrager when we acquired his business. I think he purchased that URL many, many years ago when the internet was young, and you could still get good URLs like that. So we're very fortunate to have it.
That's great. So guys, planeinsurance.com is where you can find David and team for your aviation insurance needs. David, thanks for coming on the Pilot Money Podcast.
Well, thanks for having me, Tim. I enjoyed speaking with you, and I think you're doing a great job on the podcast. So I look forward to hearing future episodes as well.
Thank you. And that brings us to the debrief section. The first point I want you to think about is work with a professional. There were so many things in today's episode that David talked about that was an education for me, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. But whole value, the liability portion of your policy, pilot warranties versus named pilots, business use of aircraft versus pleasure aircraft, a smooth limit versus a passenger sublimit. But when you go to insure your aircraft, you're going to want to work with a professional who has been doing this for a while, someone who has a lot of time in the seat versus trying to figure it out on your own. And there's a lot of value in this idea of working with a professional, whether you're insuring a plane, building a home, completing a financial plan, right? When you realize that, hey, this is a bit more complex than I'm equipped to handle, or it's a bit more complex than you want to handle, or that you have time to handle, then that's a great indication that it may be time to begin working with a professional. So that's point number one. Point number two is keep the big picture in mind. David talked about over the last several years, aircraft values have been going up. And it could have been tempting for an owner to think short term and say, well, maybe the value of my aircraft didn't go up by that much. And so I'll avoid increasing my coverage because you got it. They didn't want the premiums to go up. And so David was clear to point out that plane insurance is unlike car insurance, where if you total your car, the insurance company will go out to the marketplace, they'll look at current values and apply that accordingly to your case. But with airplane insurance, he said, what your policy says is what the insurance company is going to pay out. So you can think about what that would mean to your own cash flow, to your own resources, if your replacement cost went way up, but your airplane is underinsured and you had an incident where you needed to use the policy. I see this a lot with life insurance, right? Guys will move from the regionals to the majors or from the military to the majors and, not want to increase their life insurance initially. But meanwhile, the pay has increased, the lifestyle and the obligations to the family has increased. And so if you want to think that if your family had a circumstance where they needed to rely on that life insurance because they lost you and your income, if you've put a little pre-work in ahead of time to making sure that the policy is right size for your needs, that can go a long way. So you want to keep the big picture in mind. Of course, the more coverage, the more premium. So we don't want to be overinsured, but we certainly do not want to be underinsured. And then point number three, the last thing that I'll have you to think about is that there is value in long-term relationships. So David mentioned that insurers like long-term clients. And when you compare that to the ads or the commercials that we hear, car insurance, and you can save 15% in 15 minutes if you switch. Honestly, I haven't heard that in a long time. I don't even know if that's still the jingle, but it's worked, right? Because I can pull it up out of my memory. So David's point, though, is that there's benefits to being a long-term client that can pay off. He said sometimes his brokerage is able to get things done that other brokers cannot, simply because they've been working with the same client for a long time. So they know that client, they know their flying, they know their aircraft, and what another broker or underwriter might perceive as a specific risk that they're unwilling to take, the familiar broker understand really if that's a risk or if it's not, right? That's one thing. He also said, hey, if you are planning to fly as long as possible and you're going to be considered a senior pilot, then having the same insurance broker and also time and type will help you out. That will keep you flying for as long as possible. And then the last thing that this heading, right, the value in long-term relationship is that obviously there's value in long-term relationships, but look, if your current broker is not satisfactorily meeting whatever your insurance needs are, then you want to be proactive with shopping for a different broker. We talked about it early on in the episode about that 90-day lock when you get a quote. So you get a quote and it's going to lock you from getting another quote in the industry for 90 days. And you heard it, that your insurance broker will send you the renewal about 90 days before you're due. So he gave some excellent points on how to interview a potential broker to see if it's going to be a good relationship for you. And then just be proactive and be aware about that 90-day freeze. So point number 3, there's value in long-term relationships. That's with airplane insurance. We see the same with financial planning clients as well. I think there's probably other places as well that long-term relationships has value above, the dollars and cents that we can calculate. So we'll get you out of here on that. Thanks for joining this episode. David's information is all in the show notes. So if you're in need of aircraft insurance, give them a look. Thanks for joining this episode, and we will see you next time. Thank you for joining this episode of Pilot's Portfolio. If you found this information helpful, spread the word and share it with a pilot buddy. Or if you have questions and there's something that you would like to hear discussed on the show, send us an email. You can find the address in the show notes. For those of you who are ready to learn how we help professional pilots with their financial planning needs, schedule an appointment. Until next time, keep the shiny side up, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Pilot's Portfolio is hosted by Timothy P. Pope. Timothy P. Pope is principal owner of 360 Aviation Advisors. 360 Aviation Advisors is a registered investment advisory firm regulated by the state of North Carolina in accordance and compliance to the securities laws and regulations. 360 Aviation Advisors does not render or offer to render personalized investment or tax advice through Pilot's Portfolio. The information provided is for informational purposes only and may not be suitable for all investors and does not constitute financial, tax, investment, or legal advice. All investments involve a degree of risk, including the risk of loss.